Hello and welcome to, I think this is the second episode of Taking Liberties for the year, or is it?
It's the
Or is it
first.
the
It's
first?
technically the first. Last one
It's
was
technically.
the throwback from last year.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so it's the first episode for the year, and we've basically decided that we're going to open up with the two big ones, which is actually no, I haven't introduced who's here yet. So let's start with that. So we've got Lee over in West Australia
Hello.
and Zeev over in Victoria.
Greetings.
I should really state, for the record, it's actually called the People's Republic of Victoria. So democratic.
Yeah.
Greetings,
you're
comrades.
Yeah.
So keeping that in mind, we're going to talk about the, I guess you could say, culture of anti-conservative views at Google, which is the topic of James Damore's suing of them, I believe. And we'll get stuck into that because there's a lot of meat in there. And also, apparently, some countries are shitholes, according to Trump. So, getting straight into it. The name James Damore probably is not really well known to people, and the only reason he kind of exploded was because he got fired from Google for writing a memo. And the memo basically said Google's hiring practices and diversity programs may not appeal to the women that they want to try and hire, which is not that controversial in opinion in my view, but apparently it was pretty controversial at Google, and he was subsequently fired. Now, it turns out, as per the allegations to the Californian Labor Board, I believe it is, I think no. The Californian Labor Board gave him the right to sue. So, according to the application that he's made, he experienced a large amount of workplace bullying. Apparently, his boss wrote an email saying that either the boss himself or he would end up getting fired, and he was going to make sure that would happen. A response to this was HR basically told him to work from home and then fired him 3 days later. So, that's just the first one. There's also loads of examples of intimidation and harassment at the workplace. So, before throwing it to Lee and Zeev to answer, my personal opinion is I think Google as an employer can hire and fire for whatever reason. I do believe in the right to fire. However, there is a question here about, can companies encourage bullying at the workplace? And I don't think they should.
Yes, I mean, it would depend, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, if Google wants to have an ideologically consistent approach to their employees, that's fine. Even if they're bullying, I think it's a douchebag thing to do, but I don't think the law should stop them. I'm somewhat persuaded by the argument that James Damore was fired because it hasn't, how sexual harassment suits work in the US would make it very difficult for them to keep him. So, if they kept him on, all it takes is for somebody to say, "Oh, there's this climate of sexual harassment. Oh, look at this memo." That seems plausible to me. It seems plausible that as a response to
that memo is not an example of sexual harassment in the least.
Well, I mean, I suspect that it's not something you really want to take a gamble on. You think about Google and how many employees they have. And just HR in general would be a nightmare for them to deal with. To then add that into the mix for everybody who has a grievance who leaves us to then lodge a case of sexual harassment, because that's the thing. The process is the penalty. The process is a punishment. So, they don't even have to be successful. They just need to get them to the stage where they're negotiating and they're saying, "I want a $20,000 settlement. Otherwise, we bring up the memo," and they're gonna have to face that every single time they have any female employee leaves who has a grudge, an accident mind. So,
conversely, the responses to James Moore's memo would also then provide excellent examples of anti-political bias, which is also protected.
Sure, yeah. Well, I guess that's what we're going to see. So, I mean, that's the other side of things. I mean, I suspect
the key difficulty is what Lee has said here, that there are compliance costs associated with people issuing memos like these because of anti-discrimination laws. And even leaving aside anti-discrimination laws, this is not exactly a memo that is out there to make friends with the rest of the Google community, given that Google has a strong ideological bent in a particular direction. So while I'm not saying that I would adopt Google's hiring practices necessarily, I can also see why they let the man go, because it was a HR nightmare. And whether discrimination law, I mean, really this is interesting because libertarians are usually all about, discrimination law being bad, but now, and certainly conservatives are associated with that perspective as well, but now a supposedly conservative person is protesting that he was discriminated against for being a conservative. It's a curious situation, certainly.
Well,
can I just make a quick more point, just about the whole sexual harassment thing? So, I think sexual harassment is still far more spicy. It's far more PR difficult than targeting of conservatives. I mean, obviously conservatives, the conservative press, Fox News and all of those, they're all probably frothing with outrage. But that's not exactly unusual. And certainly in the mainstream press, a big sexual harassment suit is more of a problem than James Damore getting upset. I mean, he's not... Yeah, I think women claiming sexual harassment is just a much more sympathetic notion than some white guy saying, "Oh, I've been discriminated against." I think a lot of people are going to be like, "Well, he probably had it coming," or something like that.
Yeah, that's true. You're right. From a public relations standpoint, I mean, they're pretty obviously. I mean, based on the past history of the lawyer that he's got, and the lawyer that he's got with respect to these particular cases, she literally takes on political discrimination cases, like 80% of the time. And her last payout was something like $17.5 million. Right. So they're gonna get hit in the six-figure range for sure.
Oh, for sure.
It's gonna be painful. But you're right. I mean, the PR disaster on the opposite end of the fence is probably significantly worse than the payout that they're going to give to James Damore.
Yeah, for sure.
Assuming they give him a payout, which they may, but we don't know, of course.
You're right. I mean, would they play with this particular lawyer? I suspect not. This is
also it depends who's bankrolling the lawsuit. So it could entirely be that rich conservatives are funding the lawsuit and want to see an outcome. I mean, you think about Peter Thiel with the Gawker case. So he, for those who aren't aware, Hulk Hogan had a sex tape that was published by Gawker, and Peter Thiel, because he hated Gawker, bankrolled his lawsuit. And
then bought Gawker.
And then he's buying Gawker, which is kind of funny. But if they, the conservative backers, they might not care if there's a settlement or not. They just want to punish Google, or they may just want to try to make the political side of this. And so, I mean, it could be a situation where James Damore wins, but he would have got a bigger payout if he'd settled. But if you're a conservative backer, they may not care. They might just write James Damore a check and say, "We'll give you this money if you just put your name on this case that we'll use to prosecute the case against."
It's ironic that labor laws instituted by the Californian government, which is a democratic government, and which increase the cost of hiring and firing employees, are being used in this way. I have to say. It is very ironic, and
but totally
I'm happy at the outcome. Yeah,
totally expected.
Yes, I can't say I'm pleased in a way, because I don't like to see these suits being instituted. I see them as quite wasteful, but I guess it's massive press for this man and for his views. Perhaps, I don't know. Well, another fire for conservatives to get around and. Let's all pick up our pitchforks and burn Google at the stake, I suppose.
Well, the interesting thing is this has actually been a huge loss. Well, not a huge loss, but a significant loss on Google's part as well. So this guy actually won multiple awards inside Google. He had stellar performance reviews quite often, actually. I think he's been working there for 6 years or something, and he got the Young Rising Award and something else. I can't remember. He's got 2 awards. He had really good reviews from his managers and stuff like that. So they've lost a fairly good worker. And the thing is, this actually, and the thing is, this was all based on Google asking feedback from their engineers, right? They elicited this feedback, right? That's the really dodgy part. So, not dodgy part. Sorry, that's the part that I find amusing. I mean, yes, it's good to ask about the corporate culture or something within the company. You're having better management with your workers, but. And we're starting to see this more and more often, is that we've got these diversity boards that start up in very large organizations that are powers to themselves, right? Or rather have very little oversight from up top. And effectively, they end up, rather than promoting harmony or sort of deconflicting issues, they tend to escalate it. And the result of that has been now, they may be because of the memo they may have faced.
Well, yes. I mean, you might say exactly that. I mean, you might say, look, by the way, these diversity practices are in part influenced by federal or state anti-discrimination law as far as it relates to gender. You might say, perhaps if those HR people went there, that memo would have been received at the top. They would have said, gee, this is long, let's chuck it in the bin and forget it ever happened. And everyone would have moved on with their lives. And nobody would have kicked up a fuss. If it was leaked, Google would have said, we read it, let's move on. We don't really see much to say. We don't have any comment. The point is, it would just be a passing note in the breeze if he wasn't fired in the first place. And that's the curious thing, because anti-discrimination law has both instigated the firing of this man and in turn instigated him suing Google. It's just bizarre to witness this happen. I mean, to me, what a lawyer's picnic too, I must say.
It is a lawyer's picnic.
I should get in on that.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of, for those who would support these sorts of laws, for them, I imagine this sort of thing would be almost like confirmation of their beliefs about, I don't know, like male entitlement or white toxicity or whatever other jargon they have for this sort of thing. For them, they would turn around and say, aha, he really, because he did this, because he's got this argument.
This is why we need
this is why we need in the first place. We need to purge these people, essentially. That's their thinking. Which is, I mean, I always try to take the long view on these things. Like, right now, the left is the institutional force, but they weren't always like that. And I suspect, these sorts of, frameworks and status quo things, like, they would have been used against gay people or blacks or, women. Or, there's all sorts of, it's not like this is just like all of us, everything's been all, wonderful and great and harmonious, and then all of a sudden all these horrible lefties came in and started doing all these terrible things. It's really just a back and forth. 50 years ago,
people need bonfires and witches to burn at the stake. Today it's this, tomorrow it'll be something else.
That's it.
Yesterday it was something else entirely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we had the same thing here, right? Every one of these laws that were that have been written to protect minorities eventually eventually someone else is going to be the minority.
Yeah.
Right. And so the law ends up protecting them, even though your cultural dynamic, I guess you could say, zeitgeist doesn't necessarily follow that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a good point to move on from, because I think that's spot on.
Are you getting at the what is it? The Japanese, for example, community took issue with that Korean statue in commemoration of, or was it Chinese, perhaps, I forget, of sex slaves, and they issued an 18C complaint against it, which was dismissed.
That's right.
But I guess it's part of that. Part of the ways in which these things can really provoke unintended consequences. I don't think the original creators of 18C thought, well, this is a historical battle that we really need to engage in. That's obviously what a select part of the Japanese community thought. Anyway, moving on.
Yeah. So I guess the second topic is, so this actually requires a little bit of setup because about a week ago today, the Trump administration cancelled something called the TPS. The TPS is the Temporary Protection. I can't remember the last word, but it's basically, yeah, probably. So, yeah, it's a scheme. It's the equivalent of what we call the TPVs in Australia or the temporary protection visas. It was instituted in it was instituted in 1994 under the Clinton administration, and it basically said that the president could allow temporary visas to be issued to people who are escaping a dangerous situation that eventually will return home. Now, this was primarily used by Hondurans after an earthquake in 2001. And subsequently, it's also been used by people from Haiti and a lot of other Latin American countries who are basically fleeing some form of trouble, one or other. Now, he cancelled that Tuesday last week. So it would have been Wednesday our time. And what ended up happening is some senators from the US, some senators decided to talk to the president to see if they could get at least some form of relief from the president in stopping the deportation of some Haitians, Hondurans, and a whole bunch of other Latin American countries.
And that's it should be added with a delayed date. So it will be effective from the 9th of September 2019 for anyone from El Salvador and to the 22nd of July for anyone from Haiti. So basically on that day, unless the people from those two countries have some other visa eligibility in respect of those places, I assume the result is that they will be deported.
Correct. So the senators were trying to get that delayed even further, right? Because understandably, these people have been in the country for a long time. Some of them have children who are US citizens. So there's a lot of questions here that has happened for so long. Why don't you just offer them amnesty? Why don't you offer them a bridging visa? All sorts of discussions about how they can try and stay in the country. And they obviously went to talk to Donald Trump about they had a meeting with Donald Trump about this. At that meeting, it was alleged that he called a bunch of countries shitholes, right? And he said something along the lines of, why don't we get Norway? We don't need Haitians coming here. Why don't we ever get refugees from Norway coming here? These countries are shitholes. That's allegedly his wording. Now, obviously, the media blew up about this and started going on about, oh, look, these countries aren't shitholes, blah, 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 blah. Whatever the whataboutism that usually goes about with the media. So I remember posting that I think that this is basically Trump having won the debate because effectively now, instead of the senators getting what they wanted, which is a way for these people to stay here, the media has now presented the case that, hey, these countries aren't shitholes, they should go back.
But that's not necessarily what the people in Congress or whoever it is that is advocating for them would be saying at this point. The argument would be that they've been here for 6 or 7 years already
or
and
in
made
some
a home
case,
here.
17 years. Yeah, and that is their argument.
17 years, there you are. Yeah. I don't know the time frame exactly.
Don't get me wrong, I agree with you. It's just if you listen to the average voter, so if you talk about what's happening with the average voter, the mainland America, the one that actually Trump seems to be very well engaged with, they obviously see, hey, it's a temporary protection visa, right? And these countries, the media is telling me that they're not shitholes. Why can't they just go back there?
Well, the obvious retort is that they've been here so long, I think. And I think even the average voter can understand that. But anyway, maybe I'm being too generous, but I doubt it.
You're being extremely generous.
Okay. From what I see, people do have some empathy for people who've been here a long time, even if they have support for border controls. So I don't know about that.
Often it's, do you like, Chinese people? Oh, no, I don't. Oh, but this Chinese family next door, do you like them? Oh, yeah, I love them, or whatever. To insert your ethnic identity. I mean, I think Australians broadly don't like Americans, except for the Americans they actually get to meet, and they find them quite personable. So
I was going to use Muslims, but yeah, sure.
But like, it's true. Like when immigrants are an abstract group, this amorphous blob over there being all shifty and menacing, like people are like, oh no, don't like them. But when they actually meet people who are just normal people, they're like, oh well, they're okay. I mean, I think the implication, I think the standard kind of libertarian response here, and I mean, I think that's how a lot of certainly libertarian organizations have responded by pointing out that everybody comes from these places to begin with. Like, I mean, it's really, I mean, I think Trump's attitudes towards immigration is just tapping into standard scaremongering about foreigners. And
it's standard nativist tendencies. Yeah. There's no doubt of that. It's a standard nativist response.
Yep. And in America, it was the Irish. I mean, so a podcast that I've been listening to a lot recently is the Unregistered with Thaddeus Russell, and he talks a lot about immigration. And he pointed out that essentially the Irish was seen as no better than blacks back in the early parts of last century. Like they were equivalent. They were essentially European Negroes.
If you go back to the 1700s, they were actually worse than blacks.
Yeah.
So they were serious. They genuinely tried to kick not kick, but prevent the Irish from coming to America.
And Jews were seen the same as Chinese, and like every time there's a different group, it's the same rhetoric.
There's the usual hysteria and rhetoric and all of that. It happens again and again and again.
Yeah,
and I know I've definitely said on this show that in the 80s there was a firebombing campaign of Vietnamese restaurants in Western Australia. There's a guy called Jack Van Tongeren who went around firebombing Vietnamese restaurants because they were the enemy. They were the great problem. They're undermining our wonderful country. And when was the last time you saw anybody who was upset about the Vietnamese? I mean, the quote by Goff talking about those effing bolts coming here is like it's just a weird historical relic because
wait. He firebombed Vietnamese restaurants.
Yes, as part
of.
So
where was he? Where was he going to get his banh mi's?
Yeah, well, obviously he thought. Yeah, I mean that's the thing. Like Asian, like Chinese and Vietnamese people are so ubiquitous. And I guess just Indians. I mean, I don't even remember a great fear-mongering campaign against Indians, but like the notion that we would need to get rid of these people. That
you weren't alive for that.
Gang. Well,
you weren't technically alive for it. So,
I probably wasn't. It probably did exist, but it's just weird to think that. And now it's almost that they're white. Like essentially, I mean, they're not strictly so, but like I mean, over time, so the Irish are white, Jews are white. Southern Europeans and Eastern Europeans are now white. I mean, we have this term Caucasian, so the white people are associated with the Caucasus, which is in Eastern Europe. Those people weren't white.
Which I've always found weird. Yeah.
Interestingly, so this podcast I mentioned, Unregistered, he's going into that. He goes into that a lot on his show because he's a historian, he's got a PhD from Columbia, and he says that the notion of Caucasians was invented for World War II, that it was invented to get people to hate the Nazis enough on racial basis so they can support the notion of a war. So the term Caucasian, as referring to white people, comes from World War II and from the academics who are hired to drum up support for American involvement in World War II.
Huh.
Really,
I can believe
stuff.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But by the way, like seriously, there is nothing that's frustrated me more because I mean, you guys don't get this as much as I do because I'm brown and I'm expected to behave a certain way, right? But when I encounter people that say, white people this, white people that, I go like, that sounds really racist to me. And they go like, what do you mean? I go like, you realize there's no such thing as an amorphous blob of white people, right?
Yeah.
Really, I'm just like you realize there's Latin, there's, there's obviously the British Isles, and even within the British Isles, you've got the Irish, you've got the Scottish.
You got the Welsh. I imagine if you go to a hardcore Welsh nationalist, they're not going to appreciate you calling them English. They get pissy about it.
Yeah, they got freaking pissy about it. And then I'm just like, and then you got the Scandinavians, right? Who've got a very proud thing over there. You've got the Balts, right? And they've got like their own freaking deal. They do not like they've been at the forefront of Turkish invasion for a long time, and they do not like the Turks.
The Balts.
Yeah, the
Slavics.
Yeah,
the Slavics. Yeah,
because I was there's an entire race of Andrew Bolts out there.
No.
Gee, those must be very angry.
ALTS. So a whole race of Andrew Bolts would be novel.
But anyway, the Slavs, right? The Slavs.
So that's his readership base on the block. Yeah. I got it now.
He's just cloned himself. That's why he's the most popular columnist in Australia. The Bolts.
And yeah, but anyway, so I cop a lot of shit from primarily left-wing people for making this distinction, and then I'm just like, wait, hang on. So you're willing to make the distinction that there is a difference between Chinese, Vietnamese, Korean, right, and Japanese because there fucking is.
Yeah.
Right. You're able to make that distinction, but you can't make that distinction for different countries inside Europe. Are you fucking insane? Right. Followed by, do you realize how racist you sound?
No.
The answer is yes, they are insane. No, they don't realize how racist they sound. I mean, that's true. I mean, that's sort of like if we just talk about sort of racial rhetoric in general. I mean, the notion that you have blacks is similarly as weird. You know, like I mean, so blacks, as in the American context, when you talk about African Americans, in some ways they are a separate ethnic group. Like they were drawn from all over West Africa. But really, like the experience of being slaves and living there and what they went through has kind of created a separate group of people. If you came from Nigeria and you go to the US, you're not black in that regard. You're not African American.
And quite similarly, a lot of African American leaders historically, not necessarily now, their parents originated from the West Indies.
Yes.
And didn't actually have that slave migrant experience. So they're black in colour, but in some ways they're recent entrants into the African American community, so to speak. Or President Obama, his parents, one was from where was it? Kenya.
It's Kenya.
Kenya.
That's it. So he was born into a family raised by his American white mother, and in a lot of ways he was not part of the African American community, quote unquote. He was raised in that kind of white American context and setting.
Raised by a white academic woman, so it's not like he's like living in the ghettos.
No, not at all.
Yeah, so I mean, just so can I interrupt, Camille Foster, going back to the West Indies thing, Camille Foster, who's an American libertarian, his parents are Jamaican, and he talks about this on the podcast I've heard him. So he's from Free Think Media. He talks about how essentially he's black when he wants to be. That's how sort of Jamaicans think of themselves. Like when normally they kind of look down on African Americans, but there's other times when they sort of feel like they want to sympathize with them, they can sort of put that on. So it's interesting. And actually, I mean, another good example is Jews in Israel. There is, from what I understand, within Israel, even though you think, oh, well, all Jews are the same, but they're not all the same.
No.
Jews from Russia, Jews from Eastern Europe are very different from Palestinian Jews, and then very different again from, say, Ethiopian Jews, who are...
I was going to say, the Ethiopian Jews.
They're all cultural subsets of countries from all around the world who identify as Jews religiously, all turning up at the same place and saying, well, we're all Jews, and therefore all should be here. It's an interesting idea. But yes, and the other one I think is even the civil rights leadership. A lot of them had West Indies backgrounds. So it's I found it an interesting chapter in history. I think it was I can't remember. It was either Walt Williams or Thomas Sowell, one of those two, those black American economists who went into this history and wrote an article on it, which is how I came to know about it in turn. Anyway, which is interesting stuff.
I mean, I think that's where libertarianism gets race right, in the sense that we understand that everybody's an individual. And we just say there is no such thing as a black person race, or a Jew or a... You know, like you are just an individual, and to the extent which you identify with your ethnic heritage is entirely up to you. You know, so I mean, if you think about the Australian context in terms of, say, Aboriginality, you know, Bess Price and Jacinta Price would think very differently about race than, say,
they do.
Yeah, like then you know, even people like so what's her name in the Northern Territory? There's I can't remember. It starts with them. Anyway, like other sort of black academics and, you know, black leaders, like Aboriginal leaders. Even within the Northern Territory. So, you know,
Yeah, you've got Noel Pearson as well, and like
Yeah.
all these other, so yeah, and Ken Wyatt as well. So I mean, there's loads of different opinions around even in communities, but that's a different discussion. Actually, I was going to say next week we've got probably our annual Australia Day episode or something like that.
We'll be talking about Trump, but yeah, we could do Australia Day around round 15. I'm with
Oh dear.
Well, actually, I'm going to be making a similar style to the gay marriage thing. I'm going to be making a 3 best and 3 worst arguments to change the date.
Okay.
Okay.
And 3 best and 3 worst arguments not to change the date.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think if anybody wants a preview of what that episode is going to kind of be like, I think we've gone over it. If you just go to like takingliberties.com and just search Australia Day, it will come up as the episodes. I think we've done about 2 or 3 episodes.
Yeah,
on this,
they're usually episode 3 of the year.
Yeah. Funny that.
Maybe we should bring what is it? Abortions for some, miniature Australian flags for others. That line from The Simpsons. Well,
right. The reality is, and I'm going to finish off the episode on this. There are good and bad reasons for just about every debate you can think of, right? And my philosophy, I guess you could say, is as much as we expose the bad arguments, we will be experienced to hear the good ones, or rather, the more we recognize and identify the bad arguments and why they're bad, or why they're unconvincing, the better we are at getting to the more convincing arguments.
Yeah, for sure.
Okie doke.
That's a good place to leave it. So.
Yeah. So catch that episode and like, comment, and subscribe to this video. All the usual stuff, and catch you next week.